video, we looked at the workflow for creating a playground or console application within Xcode, where we can just focus in on the Swift language. But now we want to move into what's the workflow for creating an actual iOS app that would reside on an iPhone or an iPad or even an iPod. So there are two ways of doing apps. One is to use Storyboards, which is the more traditional method. And then in the next video, we'll look at how to create apps using Swift UI, which is a programmatic way and a newer, probably the future of iOS app development, a newer way of creating apps within Xcode. So in this video, we're going to talk about using a storyboard, and we're going to create the same app we did earlier to find the area and circumference of a circle, but this being an iPhone app will be much more visual, and we'll create an interface using the storyboard.
Now, just to remind you, the word storyboard is used in two different contexts in this course. Previously, I showed you or talked to you about creating a wireframe or a sketch of what your interface would look like. And the term used for that coming out of Hollywood is storyboards. They would storyboard each scene as a sketch of what a scene of a movie would look like. So I showed you a storyboard sketch that I created for our circle calculator. And I would normally just do this with paper and pencil, but there's also tools out there. You can use Photoshop, you can use Adobe XD, Sketch. There's a bunch of different graphics programs that you could use for this. I often just do it paper and pencil. The idea is I could take this sketch and give it to a developer who could then create the interface in whatever tools they're using. And in our case, it's going to be Xcode, creating an iOS app using the interface builder with Storyboard, our second context, which we use to develop the interface. I've already created this in Xcode using the interface builder and Storyboard. Here is my application running in the iOS simulator, and I'm emulating an iPhone 8 Plus. And in Xcode, we can operate all different types of emulators or simulators, different models of phones and iPads. So I'm going to type into my text box here of 20 for the diameter going across, and then we'll click the calculate button. There's some instructions here in this little field. I'm using the instructions in the output field, so you're going to see this text change as soon as I click calculate, and I'm told the circumference is 62.83, and that makes sense. It's the diameter times pi, so 20 times 3.14, we would anticipate roughly 62 or something. And then if I take the radius, which would be half of that 10, and squared it, that's going to be 100. And 100 times 3.14 of pi is going to give me 314.16. So my results here, I'm pretty confident are accurate. But you can see how the time I took to sketch this out and figure where things went made it much easier for me to create my application in Xcode. So let me walk you through the process now, the workflow of doing this in Xcode, starting from scratch, from the very beginning. I'm going to start up Xcode. Again, I'm running version 12.3. And we're going to create a new Xcode project. So in the splash screen, I'm going to choose this first option. And I can choose the platform I want to create for. We're going to create iOS, which is iPhone, iPad. I want to create an app. I'm going to click the Next button and give my product a name. I'm going to name it 00B Circle Calculator. And I'm doing this in spring 2021, so I'll add an S 2021. Once you have your Apple ID and your developer, you can create your team. Your organization identifier is going to be a reverse URL of your website. In this case, you can just use com dot in your last name. And we have interface. And our choice here is Swift UI. That's sort of the newer way of creating apps. We're going to traditionally, though, start with storyboards. So I'm going to choose Storyboard for my interface. We want the UI kit app delegate for our lifecycle. Language you're using is Swift. And I'm going to click Next. I can choose where I want to save it. I'll just click the Create button. And let me take my screen to full screen. So let's look at the Xcode environment here. So on the left-hand side is what we call the Navigator Panel. In the Navigator Panel, it lists, in the first tab here, it shows the project navigator and lists the files that are part of my project. Now, some of these are generated by Xcode. We don't have to modify them, but others, such as our main storyboard, is where we'll create our interface, and then the code that we write will be in the ViewController.Swift. So we'll be using those files a lot. We'll also add in the graphics and our icons in the assets folder. But if I just click on my project here, I can see the general information, and I can choose what version of iOS I want to target. Now, if you target something pretty new, older phones won't be able to use it. I'm going to go down to iOS 13, and I can choose do I want it to be iPhone or iPad. When you start going between these different devices and different platforms, there's a lot more work to do in getting it to look good on both. So I'm going to say, for now, pick a device you want to generate for. I'm going to work on iPhone. And also, if you go portrait and landscape, there's additional work we need to do. So I'm going to choose the orientation that I want to use, which for now it's just going to be portrait. So I'm going to design for a portrait app on an iPhone using or targeting the iOS 13 operating system. And I'll show you a little bit how you can choose the different emulators you want to test this on. I'm going to suggest, as you're designing, if you have an iPhone or you have an iPad, design for that device that you have, then you can test it on those devices and see how it looks on that device. If you don't, I'm going to suggest probably sticking with iPhone. And I like to target, in the emulators, I tend to do the iPhone 8 Plus as a great starting point. It's got a nice amount of real estate, but it looks good on the screen. It's not too big. It's a great place to design. There are things here where you can choose your certificate to sign with. You'll have to create a certificate as a developer, and you can look at Apple documentation on how to do that. You need to have a certificate of authentication, though, when you go to put it into the Apple Store. Most of the other things you can kind of not worry about at this point. I'm going to go back to General, and I want to look at the Storyboard. Now, before I get there, let me just point out a couple of things here about the interface. As I mentioned, there's a bunch of tabs here across the top of our Navigator. So if we were using Git, we could look at products in GitHub or code in GitHub. When you have errors, this little triangle is a great place to see what your errors are and get information about them. Everything else for now we're just going to ignore. I'm going to go back to the project navigator, and I'm going to bring up the main storyboard. This is where we'll create our interface. So I click that, and let's look at a couple things here. So this area here in the center, this is our editor or editing panel. This is where you do most of your work, and you can actually have multiple windows here. Right now we're looking at just our main.storyboard file. We see a screen that looks like a phone, outline of a phone, and down here I can choose how I want to view this. What model of phone do I want to view this on? I'm going to click that, and I'm going to come over here to the iPhone 8 Plus. That's where I kind of like to design around. And you can choose a black appearance or a white appearance. And I can choose the orientation. So if you chose design for portrait orientation, you want it that way. If you're designing an app for landscape orientation, you can rotate it. I can also zoom in and zoom out here. And sometimes it's easy to lose your screen if you're zoomed in and zoom out, or you move things around. Over here on the left-hand side of the editor panel is our view controller scene. Notice I can expand that. And if you just simply click on view controller here, that'll put it back in the center. Little trick there. So you notice I kind of zoomed in at 100%. It went off the screen. I'm going to click off view controller, click one of the other objects. It'll come back into the center. Over on the right-hand side is our inspector panels or inspectors. And again, there's a bunch of tabs here at the top. We'll use these to change the attributes of the various objects that we put on our interface. So I'm going to begin designing my application. Oh, there's one more thing. Let me go to the View menu. And there's also a Debug Area. I'm going to open up the Debug Area and activate the console. So here's our Debug Area. When you're testing your application, you'll probably want to have this open. You'll be able to watch the values of different variables over here on the right-hand side. If you set up something to print, and we might use print as a way of just checking to see what our values are, or doing some debugging. When you print out of Swift, that will appear over here on the right-hand side. I'm sorry, did I say left-hand side earlier? So your variables on the left-hand side, your print statements will appear on the right-hand side. I can also hide the debug area by clicking this little icon, and that goes away. Okay, so that's the layout of Xcode. Let's begin working with our toolbox to add some objects into our interface. Up here at the top right, you'll see a button with a plus sign. That opens up the library. So I'm going to open up the library, and in the library, I can choose objects to drag over onto my interface. I'm going to start with a label. So I'm going to bring a label over. I'm going to place it up here at the top. And then once I get the handles, I can stretch that label out. With that label selected in the inspector panel, I can look at the attributes, and that's that third icon from the right here, the attributes inspector. And the first thing I want to change here is the text that's in my label. So I'm going to highlight the word label here and change this to circle calculator. I'm going to press the enter key. Now I want this to be aligned in the center, so I can change the alignment. I also want to change the font here a little bit, make it a bit larger. So I can use these arrows to go larger or smaller, or I can also click the little font icon here and change the size here. I can also drag through the 18. Maybe I want to make this 21. But I also want to change the style here to be bold. Make sure you press the enter key when you put in the size. So now I got 21 point bold, and I can even change the font here. I'm going to recommend sticking with the system font, unless you need, for some purposes, something more decorative. The system font is SF Pro, and in the Human Interface Guidelines, they recommend that you use SF Pro, or you can also use New York if you want a serif font. Now I want to add another label. Notice that my library went away. So here's another little trick. If you hold down the Option key and click the library, it comes up as a floating window. I can close it by clicking the red X, or expand it full screen by clicking the zoom button. But now as I drag objects over, this won't go away every time. It'll stay there until I close it. I want another label. So I'm going to put a label underneath here. And once again, in the property inspector, I'm just going to enter developed by and put my name. And I want to center that. In this case, I want to make it smaller. You can select it and use the cursor arrows on the keyboard to nudge it up, down, left, right. Okay, I want another label. And this one will get some instructions of enter diameter. Move it over. And now I want to use a text field. Text field allows an area where the user can enter information in. And again, for the property inspector, here I can change the font as we've been doing, but I can also add a background color. And I'm going to choose a light yellow. It's going to contain a number. So I'm going to make this right aligned, and I'm going to put in a value in here to start with so I can give it default text. We use 20 in our example. I'll put in 20. I can see how it's going to look. So it gives me an idea if I want to change the font, make it larger, make it bold, whatever. I can also add a little border around this. Next, I'm going to add a button. And for the button, I'm going to change the text simply to say calculate. I'm going to stretch this out a little bit as well. I'm going to change the text color to be white and then change the background to be a light blue. I want something a little bit darker than that. Now, if you don't find the color that you want, you can always choose custom and create your own color. So here we have another panel that pops up. And I can create the color blue that I want. And apply that to my button. And I think actually the white kind of gets lost in that lighter blue. I'm going to go back and make my text color to be black. I'm going to do another label. I'm going to stretch this out so it can contain multiple lines. Now on this one, because I do want to have multiple lines, I'm going to change the lines. I could choose how many lines it should be able to hold. 3 would be enough. I could also set it to 0, and that'll just simply use the space that's available to me. So it'll wrap. My text here is going to be enter the diameter. Click the calculate button. To see the circumference and area of the circle. Now you can see it doesn't quite fit there. I'm going to stretch this out a little bit more. Maybe I want to make this a smaller font. I could do that. I see I've got a typo here. Let me fix that. And the last thing I want is an image. Now I created an image ahead of time that demonstrates the area and the circumference. So here's where we're going to add images to our project. To do that, I'm going to go into the assets.xcode assets folder. Changes the area of my editor. Notice we can have app icons. I'll look at that a little bit later. For now, though, I want to add a new image. And I can do that down here at the bottom. I can click plus, and I can choose to add an image set. Now, I mentioned earlier that we need different resolutions of our images as being 1x, 2x, and 3x. If you just put one size in 1x, it'll use that. And so if you're designing only for yourself, for your own phone, you can design the image for the size of your phone according to basically the pixels that you would want to display it at, and just put it into the 1x, and that'll work. Let me show you a little shortcut. First of all, I'm going to not have Xcode full screen. That's a little bit of a trick. I'm going to open up my Finder, and I have a folder here called Circle Calc Images. Inside that, I have all my different icons. We'll look at it here in a minute. But I also have my 3 images that I created showing the circumference and the area in the different resolutions of 1x, 2x, and 3x. I can take those 3 together and just drag them over here to the XCassets area, and it will actually create an image set for me with those 3 images using those 3 different versions. And it gave it the name of the file itself. So my image now is called Circle Calc. This image I didn't do anything with. I want to get rid of it. I can just click the minus sign and delete it. Let's go to those icons. So in the icons, you'll notice there are a bunch of different versions here, going from 2020 down to 1024. And so I created all those in Photoshop, and I'm going to show you later a way to do that, just taking your 1024 image and have it generate all the others. But I need to begin filling this in. So here I want my 40. It's going to drag it to that area. This one is 60 by 60. So I've named all these appropriate in terms of the size that they are. And then I need 58. So I would go ahead and do that for all of these. And you don't have to do this when you're testing your projects. It'll come up with just a default icon. You would definitely have to do this though before you put it into the App Store. Or if you want to distribute it, you probably want to have a nice icon that represents your project. Here then are all the different icons, the various sizes that the project requires. And each of these are used for different devices. All right, I'm going to go back to the main storyboard. We want to add in our image down here. So I'm going to open up my library. Again, I'm going to hold down the Option key, click the plus sign. You'll see a cursor flashing here under Objects. If you know what you're looking for, you can just begin to type that. So I'm looking for an image object. I'm going to type I, M, and here I see different objects that have the letters IN. Image view, main menu, submenu, inline section menu. I want an image view. So by the way, all the controls we're using here are called views. So I'm going to bring a image view over. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. I always want to design some margins on the top right and bottom. Okay, so here's my image view. In the Attributes panel, I can choose the image. I'm going to click this downward arrow here. Notice there's some images that come with Xcode, but here's my Circle Calc. It's going to list all the image sets that you have in your XCassets here. We only have one, that's Circle Calc. And there's my image. In a future lesson, we'll create different images to be displayed in this image view based on some buttons. So we can change the image programmatically. That's my interface. I don't need the library anymore. I'm going to get rid of it. What I need to do now is to code this. But what we can do is we can see what this is going to look like on our emulator. So up here is a little play button, and we can see our project and then the various emulators that we have here. And you can see I've got a whole bunch of different emulators as far as devices, along with different operating systems. So you can add additional simulators here. Maybe you want to have an iPhone 8 Plus running iOS 12. Maybe that's what your phone is. You want to test that. I've got the 8 Plus here for both 14.3, which is the latest, and 13.2. Now remember, I set this up for 13.0 iOS. I don't see any emulators here that use something older than that. So while I have other emulators, say for iPhone 6, they don't appear here because the operating system on those emulators are older than my target. I'll go ahead and do a iPhone 8 Plus 13.2. And then to test, I'm going to click the little play button here. And it's going to start up the emulator. It's going to take a minute or so for that emulator to ramp up and set up the VM for it to run, and then put our project in that VM. So here's our emulator. By the way, you can watch this area up here at the top of your Xcode as to what's happening. If you have errors, they're going to show up here. I've got 5 little warnings. The warnings aren't anything to be too concerned about. It's the errors. If we had a red X, circle with a red X, that would be an issue. Little yellow diamonds or little yellow triangles here, I'm not too concerned about. Okay, so there's my project. Now, I'm losing part of my label here. If I want to fix that, either stretch that out a little bit or change the font to something smaller. Otherwise, everything else looks pretty good here. Let's see if it works. So I put in 20 as my default diameter. Click calculate. Oh, nothing happens. Well, of course nothing happens. We haven't told it what to do yet. That's the next step. We're going to code it. But I can see at least how it's going to look in my emulator. My title might be a little tight here to the top information status bar. So I'm going to bring that down a little bit too. Okay, so I usually leave my emulator running. I go back to Xcode and then I stop it using the stop button. That way, when I want to test this again for making some changes, I don't have to wait for that emulator to be loaded up into the virtual machine. Okay, so I want to stretch this out a little bit. I probably want to make it right aligned. Everything else looks pretty good. We're going to choose our title and my name, and I'm just going to use the cursor arrows and nudge that down a little bit. Everything else that looked pretty good. So the next step now is to code this. Now, a couple of things in Xcode. Let me go back to full screen. So up here at the top on our menu bar or our toolbar, there's an icon here on the far left to hide and show the navigator. In older versions, there used to be 3 buttons on the toolbar on the right-hand side, and the first one would hide that navigator. They moved it now, so it's over on the left. So if I click that, it hides the navigator. It gives me greater real estate in working with the editor. Same with on the right-hand side. I can hide the inspector panel. So I can bring the inspector panel back. I can bring the navigator panel back. In the editor, at the top is, on the far right, is a Add Editor button. I'm going to click that and get a second editor window. So it splits it in half. Now I still have my storyboard over to the left. You don't see it. So it's just so you can see that. Now I like to keep my storyboard on the left. I'm going to come over and click View Controller, so it kind of puts in that area. By the way, you can also turn this navigator off as well. That's this little button here at the bottom of the storyboard editor. Or I can bring it back. Okay. You can also resize, make that smaller if you need a little more real estate. I want to be able to write code for these controls to work. And that's going to be done in the ViewController.Swift file. Now I've closed my navigator, just so you can see in the navigator here we have our ViewController.Swift file. If I make this my active editor window, I can change it there. Okay. Let me go back to the main storyboard. I'm going to show you another way to do this. I'm going to hide the navigator. I can also use what we call the breadcrumbs. So in this editor window, which right now is my storyboard, I can come to the breadcrumbs and choose View Controller there. So there's my View Controller. Let's bring back our storyboard over here. So now I have 2 files open, and that's important because we're going to drag from our storyboard over to our ViewController.Swift file. Now we start this file, we get the name of our project here. I'm told it's the ViewController.Swift file, the name of my project. My name is the creator. It's importing UIKit, which allows us to use the storyboard. It also contains things such as the math class and so forth. Everything is done inside a ViewController class here. And that ViewController class is of type UI ViewController, which is what we have here. This is a UI ViewController. By default, I'm getting a function for ViewDidLoad. If I want to have something happen as soon as my project loads, I would add code in here to this ViewDidLoad. Now, instead, I'm going to just give a couple blank lines here. And we're going to create what we call outlets and actions. An outlet is how we name one of our views to be referenced in our code. So I want to take this text box that we created where the user entered the diameter, and I want to create an outlet for that, giving it a name. I'm going to hold down the control key in my storyboard and drag to my ViewController.Swift file. And when I let go of my trackpad or my mouse, I get a dialog box comes up here asking me to make a connection. Now I can make an outlet connection, an action connection, an outlet collection. I'm going to make an outlet. I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to name it TXT diameter. It's explanatory. The TXT tells me it's a text box or text field. So here I have a type of UI text field. I'm not going to worry about the storage as being weak or strong. I'm just going to say connect. And what I'm going to get here is a line of code that says @IB outlet weak variable TXT diameter colon, and the type is UI text field. And there's a little exclamation mark back here. This exclamation mark we call optionals or an optional. We'll talk about that later. But it's going to run this piece of code before it loads my storyboard. And what that optional exclamation says, okay, we're going to create a reference to a UI text field named TXT diameter, but right now it doesn't exist yet. Let's just put that aside and say we're going to use that later, but I'm making a reference in memory to it. That's what the optional does. I'm going to do the same thing for this label down here, which is going to be my output. I'm going to hold down the control key. I'm going to drag to my storyboard. I'm going to put it underneath my TXT diameter outlet. So it's going to be an outlet. This one I'm going to name LBL output, LBL for label. It's a UI label. I'm just going to say connect. And so I get a reference to that as well. We're not going to change the image. I don't need to make a reference to it. And we're not going to change the calculate button. I'm not going to make a reference to that. But we are going to do something different with the calculate button. I'm going to do the same thing. Hold down the control key. This time I'm going to drag to underneath that viewDidLoad method and create a new method, which is going to be an action. Now, since it's a button, it recognizes that probably what I want to create here is an action. If I wanted to create an outlet, I could do that. This is going to be an action. I'm going to name this one BTN calculate. The type, I'm going to change to UI button. I'm going to guarantee that this is a button. And then different events. So I can have different types of events that the user can interact with this button. The default here is touch up inside, and I'm going to leave it as that. And I'm simply going to click connect. So now I'm getting an @IB action function that I named BTN calculate, and it has a parameter of sender as a UI button. And then we get the two brackets. So this is a method, and I can code inside this method to make it do something. So let's code, kind of what we did before in the playground. I'm going to say let D equal, and we're going to take the double value of TXT diameter, and I want the text property. Now, when we created that TXT diameter, it didn't have a text value. And so it's giving me a little warning here. Value of optional type string has some issues. I need to make that an optional as well. So I'm going to do an exclamation mark after that, and then my closing parenthesis. And now I'm getting a warning that I've got this variable or this constant named D, but I'm not using it anywhere. That'll clear up a little bit later. That's why I say don't worry so much about the warnings. Even if I didn't do anything later, my program would still run. Here we're going to say let R equal. Now I'm not going to type, I didn't type these. D is defined as a double because I'm taking a string and making it into a double. R is going to be a double because I'm going to take the value of D. I'm going to unwrap the optional D with an exclamation mark and divide it by 2.0. When I unwrap that, I'm basically saying I guarantee that this has a value, which is one of the reasons I wanted to put in a default value here, because if we try to run it without any text in here, we would have problems. Okay, next we're going to calculate the area. So we're going to let area equal, and here I'm going to use that POW method of I want the radius squared, r comma 2, and I'm going to multiply that by double.pi. Swift is case sensitive. Make sure I haven't have the correct O there as lowercase. Once again, I'm not using area, so it's giving me a little warning. That'll go away. And then we'll say let circum equal, and again, I'm going to take the diameter as D and multiply that by double dot pi. I could have done 2r as well, 2 times r instead of the D. And then I'm going to create another variable. So it's going to be a string variable. I'll go ahead and type it as string, and it's going to equal circumference equals, and I'm going to do some interpolation here. So I'm just going to say string format, and I'm going to do 2 decimals. So in quotes %.2f, that'll give me 2 floating point decimals. And what I want to display is circum, my variable. And let's got a little spelling here, circumference. And I'm going to concatenate to that just the second line, prompt plus equals. Here we'll do a new line character, and we'll say area equals. I'm going to do the same thing. In fact, I'm just going to copy that piece of code, paste it in, and all I need to do here is change circum to area. Okay, I'm missing a parenthesis here because I need 2 right parentheses for my 2 lefts. Same thing here. Okay, so those error goes away. And the last thing I want to do is take that prompt string and put it into my label here as my output. So lbl output.text equals prompt. That's my code. I want to try to run this in the emulator. So I'm going to come back up here to the top and click the play button. It's going to build my project, compile it all into binary code, place that in the emulator. Here's my emulator running again. Now if I click calculate, I get my circumference and my area, and the project works. So let me just show you how this would look on an iPad. I'm going to go back to Xcode, stop my emulator, and let's choose, actually before I choose an iPad emulator, if you remember, when we set our project up, we chose it to be only for iPhone and not iPad. Now I can run it on the iPad, and it's going to look like an iPhone running on an iPad. Let me just choose the iPad here as an option. We'll keep it as just portrait. I'm going to go back to my project, and I'm going to change the emulator here from an iPhone 8 Plus. Let's just do a, we'll do an 11-inch iPad Pro. And I'm going to run that. So it's going to launch that emulator and put our project in that particular emulator, and we'll see what it looks like on an iPad. So you can see it just doesn't make use of the space on an iPad. We'll learn later how to set up our project with some constraints that will allow things to resize for the different platforms. So for now, you just want to design for a particular device. Return to Xcode, stop my project, and Xcode saves your project when you build it and run it, but it's always a good idea before you exit to always just say save. So that's how we build a iOS project using Interface Builder and StoryKit. If you just jumped into this video, you can see all the videos from the iOS app development cohort playlist by clicking on the image in the lower right. And if you'd like to be alerted to future videos that I create, you can click my picture up in the top right and subscribe to the channel.